Welcome to the second episode of Silicon Valley Successes, where we interview industry experts, entrepreneurs, and people that work and live in the Silicon Valley ecosystem to bring you the knowledge that they've gotten through a lifetime experience here. And we try to package it in a reference library that anyone in the world can access. So no matter where you are, you can help fulfill your dreams of being the next Silicon Valley success. Now with me today is Chishty, who has a background in investment banking and has helped startups from around the world in their strategic planning. But I'll let Shahid introduce himself a little bit more. Shahid, thank you for coming today on Silicon Valley Successes. And could you please give an intro of who you are and a little bit of background of you?
Yes, certainly. Thanks for inviting me, Shawn. It's a pleasure to be here. I actually was born in Africa, lived there till I was 11 years old.
Wow.
Then moved to London, finished off my education over there. I then started working in London with the investment banks, worked in London and Frankfurt. I've worked actually with management teams and investors around the world. I've been over here in Silicon Valley for the past 3 years, and I've very much enjoyed actually working with startups. I've been working with some of the accelerators around here as well as a mentor. And in particular, actually, I enjoy mentoring some of the impact and sustainability startups around here and connecting them with international investors, depending on where they are. I've also enjoyed working actually over the years with investor groups, which are looking at various investments, including startups.
Okay. So I guess the first question, let's go to the very, very basics. What is a fundable company? And what I mean by that is not everyone's company is what investors look for. So could you kind of give a brief introduction to what you believe is a fundable company and one that is not?
I think it varies actually. Some companies really surprise people when they get funded, I think generally those founders that come up with a novel idea, especially perhaps also those that have had a successful track record previously, not necessarily in the same area. Those founders tend to succeed. They tend to convince investors that they've got an interesting idea. And then it's a matter of building the team and undertaking the follow-through from that.
So I guess even a step back from that, if I had a bakery, would that be considered a fundable company from an angel or a VC point of view? Or does it have to have, algorithms in it? What does an investor look for?
Well, I particularly focus on technology startups, but in essence, any business which you can prove as a founder, should be viable, could potentially attract investors. You could come up with a completely new idea as to something that no one has ever done before, and it could be successful. It could be a reasonably simple idea. On the other hand, I would say, especially where I'm focusing on technology startups, is that there is a trend that the more sophisticated technologically the startup is, there's a good likelihood that it'll be successful if the idea is a good idea as well, a novel idea. I come back to the point that if the founder has got very good experience as well, that'll certainly help in terms of discussions with investors.
So talking about investors, how many different types of investors are there, and where can startups or entrepreneurs get their funding from? I mean, VCs, angels, but if you could talk a little bit about each of those, I guess, and banks and any other source.
Yeah.
And remember, think of me as someone that has never heard of any of this stuff.
Yeah. That's a very good question, actually. There are numerous routes to getting financing. In fact, I think founders and startups nowadays have a hugely greater opportunity than existed many years ago. Especially the ecosystem in Silicon Valley is extremely broad. So you have angel investors at the smaller end of the scale who will typically invest 20, 25, maybe $50,000. Some obviously can invest more than that. You've got family offices, you've got venture capitalists, and then the scale goes all the way up to private equity firms and so on.
Can we step back? Tell me about an angel investor. What is an angel investor?
An angel investor, again, there are different sorts. Sometimes you have angel investors who worked at larger corporations, and they perhaps have excess time, or they have excess cash available, and they think, okay, I can invest in something that sounds interesting, or that through their work they think they know a little bit about. And then you've got perhaps successful entrepreneurs who've actually got previous successful startups that they've maybe sold, and they bring with them certain areas of expertise, whether it's a certain vertical, say artificial intelligence or machine learning, in robotics, in fintech, all sorts of other areas like that. Or it could be a specialization in terms of what they're doing, for example, marketing, in terms of maybe certain engineering skills they have and so on. And they will typically try and invest in those areas where they can apply and they can help the founders and startups with their expertise.
Okay, so an angel investor mentioned checks between 25,000, possibly 50,000, maybe a little bit more. They might have been successful entrepreneurs or industry experts. What about the other groups you mentioned? You mentioned family funds. What's a family fund?
A family fund is essentially a fund which has been put together by a successful either founder or families. So sometimes you even have 2 or 3 generations of families that have been operating a particular business. And if they've perhaps sold that business or generated significant amounts of cash from that business, they'll put it into a fund, and then certain allocations will be decided upon. They could decide to put some in very secure investments. They could decide to put a portion of the fund into more risky investments, which it would include early stage startups and so on. So those are generally referred to then as family funds. And you've got single family funds, you've got multi-family funds. Multi-family funds being, for example, several families getting together and saying, okay, this is going to be one fund, and then they then again decide upon where their joint interests are and invest accordingly.
Okay, and then you also mentioned VC. VC, what does that stand for?
VCs are venture capitalists, and again, there's a wide range of venture capitalists. Some have interests in a particular vertical, again, like the verticals I mentioned. So it could be ag tech, fintech, med tech, health tech. There are all sorts of techs. Right. Or it could be in a geographic area that they tend to focus, or it could be a particular stage of investments that they focus on. Right. So stage of investments could be pre-seed, very early stage, where it's just an idea, to seed, and then you've got A rounds, B rounds, C rounds, D rounds, and so on, all the way until maybe a company is very large and could potentially do an IPO.
Can you talk about a little bit more of each of those stages, from the seed, pre-seed, A, all? Yeah.
Those stages vary by sector, industry, and so on. But typically a seed round would be usually up to around $1 million. In certain circumstances it could be more than that, but that's perhaps more typical. An A round could be maybe $1 to $5 million, a B round 5 to 10, and so on. It goes up in increments. Those are the typical ranges. They could vary very significantly though as well.
Okay, then let's go back a little bit. If I'm a founder of a company, when should I start thinking about raising funds? Is it when I just have an idea, or after I've already made some sales and some customer traction? When is the best time?
That's a very good question as well, and it's something that I think founders should spend more time on considering. Let's take the case of a founder who has a good idea or thinks it's a good idea. He will probably have to develop that idea. He'll have to bring other people on board to bring particular expertise in and so on.
Okay.
And there are various ways in which he could do that. He could partner with them or he could hire them. And it then depends also on the expectations and the ability of the person to undertake that work. So it could be paid work, which would be actually more unusual. So usually actually people who are founding businesses and the early participants in the business would normally provide what's called sweat equity.
Okay. Tell me about that.
Sweat equity is essentially working to get a share in the company.
Okay.
And so a founder, again, has the opportunity either to try and find these people who will co-found the business with him. And usually that will then save funds, which are normally extremely limited at the start.
Okay. So they'll give up like 5% of the company, 10%, 1%? What's kind of normal?
It could be any of those, actually. It really depends on how much the founder needs those additional areas of expertise. Again, I think if the founder can bootstrap, there's the term bootstrap, so try and get funds as the business is developing.
Okay.
That's usually a very good way of proceeding. Usually a founder will have to provide some funds him or herself, and those funds could either be personal funds, they usually are, and then actually the second step of funding would usually be what they call friends and family rounds.
Okay.
So you approach your family, you approach close friends and other acquaintances, talk to them about the idea, see if they're interested, if they're willing to invest with you. I think the main thing that founders need to bear in mind is that the earlier they seek financing, the more they're probably going to have to give away for their business. And that's why there's a recommendation that founders try and use the term I use, bootstrap, as far as is possible. So for example, if you have a good idea and you want to get it financed, you could, for example, ask or seek, for just as an example, say $5 million or $10 million.
Okay.
If you do so, however, the likelihood is, and this depends also very much on what type of business it is and how much it can be expected to generate in revenues and profits going forward. But generally, if you're looking for sizes of $5–10 million, you would probably have to give away a significant portion of your company. So the idea is to bootstrap, which would mean maybe you get your first $100,000.
Okay.
And give away a small percentage, get the product further developed. You then go and look for further equity so that your product is even more developed. And at each step, you're giving away some equity. Hopefully, you also try and develop some revenues as soon as possible. And revenues would obviously help to pay certain costs and expenses that a founder will be incurring along the way. So the timing of when to go to investors, which investors to go to, how to approach the investors to ensure that you've got the right resources on board, all of those are vital considerations for founders and for startups.
So approaching all these different groups has to take time and money.
That's right.
What should be allocated for it? What should a founder be thinking in his head when I want to raise funds? Should I allocate a month to do it, a week to do it, a lot longer? Should I allocate so much of my budget for it? What advice would you give a startup in their fundraising process and plan?
I think those are questions actually, or the answers to that question, or those questions vary significantly. Generally, though, I would say that a startup is probably going to have to develop the product or service, whatever he or she is working on, for at least probably 6 months before they're likely to have what's called an MVP.
What's an MVP?
An MVP is a market viable product.
Okay.
It could be a service as well. Generally, it would probably take about 6 months or so to get some initial external funding in place. One thing that I would recommend, though, is that founders and startups do try to get some funding reasonably early in the process.
Why is that?
And the reason I would recommend that, actually, is that if you're talking to third parties about your idea or your product or service, it's very good to see what reactions you're getting. And you can test your idea against these people, and if you can convince people to invest in your product, you're doing a pretty good job. So if you like going out to talk to third-party persons and investors in particular, give some sort of validation to what you're doing as well. And there are even founders or serial entrepreneurs who have significant funds available. However, if they set up a new startup or company, they nevertheless go out to test it and check about its viability with other investors as well. So it's a very good way of trying to get multiple eyes to look at what you're doing and to see whether what you're doing will take off or not.
Okay, so if I want to talk to investors, having a product, having some sales, great. But do I just go up to them and tell them this is my company, this is what I do, or how should I communicate with them? Do I give them any marketing material? Tell me about that.
Yeah, certainly. The founders and startups will usually prepare a pitch deck.
What's a pitch deck?
Yeah, I'll go into pitch deck. I was going to say they also will usually prepare for a short summary, so that's usually called an executive summary. But the pitch deck actually is perhaps ideally a 10 to maybe 15, mostly usually maximum 20-page set of slides, which really show what your idea is. What motivated you perhaps to undertake that startup. It provides background to the founder and perhaps other team members, which would usually be on board by then as well. It provides maybe some financial information on what the prospects for the business are. And usually it also will include what's called a go-to-market strategy. Okay. So how the founder wants to maybe develop his product or service, and then how he or she also wants to get it into, for example, if it's a retail product, out to retailers, what the strategy is, maybe locally, regionally, nationally, internationally even. So those sort of things will also be the kind of questions that investors would want to know about.
So with that, what are some of the biggest mistakes you see founders making when they approach investors or just anyone in general?
A number of startups actually just are not prepared fully. They don't consider certain information which the investors would want. Perhaps also they should decide beforehand when they're approaching the investors what exactly they're looking for from the investors and why they are approaching the investors at that stage as well. So some founders don't think all of that through, and then they stumble when talking to investors.
What tips or tricks would you give a founder wanting to raise funds?
I would say that they have to have a strong idea, a strong team, and also be driven, because it's a hard road. It's also a complicated.
They don't write a check once you arrive in Silicon Valley?
Silicon Valley is getting more and more difficult to find funds in even. I understand myself that maybe a few years ago there were perhaps a few hundred startups. Nowadays they talk about there being perhaps tens of thousands of startups in Silicon Valley. As I mentioned, I also work with accelerators, and the statistics among the accelerators show that perhaps 98% even of startups will fail.
Wow.
So it's actually a very significant percentage.
Okay, so we've talked a lot. We've talked about what a fundable company is. We've talked about the different types of investors, angels, family funds, VCs. We've talked about raising funds and a plan and some of the biggest mistakes founders make. What other information on funding do you think is very valuable for a startup, for a founder to know?
I think fundraising itself also takes a lot of effort and a lot of time. So if a founder, for example, is a programmer and he himself is preparing or developing the software, he will have to think that he's probably going to be spending at least 50% of his time undertaking fundraising. And therefore, as I mentioned before, it's well worth already developing one's team to include people that he can then rely upon to carry on perhaps the developmental stages of the product or service, while he's also working with advisors to approach investors. So I would say founders and startups should have a solid team, and they should be well prepared to talk to the investors. They should also actually make sure that they spend time looking at which investors they should be approaching. The accelerators, for example, will also typically have programs where they will invest in startups as well. The usual structure is that they will invest around $125,000. $25,000 of that might be clawed back by the accelerators for services provided. And the accelerators could take typically around 7% of the equity. So again, it's a matter of the founders and startups judging when is the time to approach investors, what help to get, for example, also in terms of board advisors, other team members, mentors as well, which accelerators perhaps to work with, because the accelerators have their own specialization. And so all of those detailed considerations which founders and startups should spend a good deal of time considering.
So quick question, if there's two people that want to invest in a startup company, what questions should that founder ask those investors if he can only take money from one of them?
Very good question. There are what's called also strategic investors. So those will be investors that have detailed knowledge of that particular area. I think the founders really should consider what they need, as I mentioned before, from the investors. Usually it's not only just money. Usually it would be very helpful to find investors. Let's say you're an ag tech startup. It would be very helpful, for example, if you could get an investor on board that could also open doors for you for the product that you're developing or the service that you're developing. And maybe they will even have expertise in certain technology that you might be developing as well. So the best thing is to find investors who are closely aligned with what the startup is doing, have funds available, and are willing maybe even to roll up their sleeves a little bit and act as an advisor and mentor as well.
When you're saying roll up their sleeves, how valuable is their network to that startup, that founder, rolling up and making introductions? How important is that?
It's extremely important. I think let's stay with the example of agtech. If an investor, for example, and let's say you're doing a hydroponics, automated hydroponics business. If you find an investor who, for example, either has himself multiple contacts with retailers, grocery retailers, for example, that could be an ideal way for you then also to get your product out to market as well. And the same thing applies to any other vertical. If it's edtech, or then if an investor has contacts with either, say, schooling systems, or, for example, with companies that already sell to schools. You know, those would be ideal sorts of investors. Typically also, say, fintech investors if they have contacts with financial institutions, insurance companies, banks, and so on. Those sort of connections are extremely helpful for startups.
Quickly, what's your opinion of crowdfunding and ICO for alternative ways to raise funding? ICO, initial coin offering, and crowdfunding, one of those platforms. Just quick 30-second answer.
Certainly. Crowdfunding is extremely useful for products, especially which are sold to consumers. ICO's, initial coin offerings, are a new development. In fact, they have proven extremely successful for some startups that have raised double-digit millions, even into the billions of dollars. It's a very different market, though, and generally those startups would need to have some sort of blockchain and perhaps AI, machine learning types of applications to be successful. But it's an area actually which is threatening the current securities industry as a whole, and even the VC industry model.
Wow. Okay. Last question. Most valuable advice you could give a founder on fundraising?
Be determined and don't give up.
All right. And Shahid, could you give everyone just a recap of who you are and what you do?
Certainly. I work with startups, mainly in the tech sector, and I work with investor groups around the world as well. With the startups, actually, generally I help them with business development, provide strategic advice, international growth and scaling I help them with, and also fundraising, exits, M&A activity. So those are the areas that I like to work together with startups on.
When's it too early for a company to approach you and ask to work with you?
I think it really depends on the idea and how novel it is. But I tend to work with companies at the earlier stage, so seed and A round, B round, rather than more developed companies.
Interesting. Now, with that, Shahid, thank you for your time today, and I want to thank everyone that has tuned in to the second episode of Silicon Valley Successes. We're very happy here to bring this information to you. Hopefully you'll utilize this in your daily life, and hopefully it'll help you get to the next stages you want. If you have any questions or you want certain information in our shows, there's ways to contact us through our website, siliconvalleysuccesses.com. And I want to thank everyone once again for taking your time and trusting us to give you valuable information that could help you no matter where you are in the world. So with that, Shahid, thank you again for all your time. I look forward to the next time you're on our show. We have to get you back. There's so much more we didn't talk about, such as we did talk about angel groups, but the construction of them, and there's just so much more. So please come back.
I'd be glad to do so. Thank you, Shawn.